of what's going on in the United States, a little bit of context as Beta Zone will tee up John Chipman.
Thank you very much, Fred Kemp, and thank you very much to the World Economic Forum Davos for giving me this opportunity to talk about shifting military power. The map that you see in front of you now is a map of the IISS, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, that demonstrate the extent, range, and depth of conflict around the world today. The majority of those conflicts are internal conflicts. And the thesis that I'm putting forward to you today is that the nature of international relations today is such that the possibility of great power conflict is back. Arguably, its likelihood is higher now than at any point in the last 25 years. And this is because two of the big powers in the world, China and Russia, are beginning to try to challenge the global predominance of the United States and its allies. And they're doing so not only on the ground, but also through their declaratory policy. Vladimir Putin, our commanders always have the authorization to use any means for the defense of the Russian Federation. The chief of his general staff, we must not copy foreign experience and chase after leading countries, but we must outstrip them and occupy leading positions ourselves. President Xi Jinping, we will make it our mission to see that by 2035, the modernization of our national defense and our forces is basically completed, and that by the 21st century, our people's armed forces have been fully transformed into world-class forces. And the French naval commander noting the strategic landscape is changing rapidly. China, for example, built in the last 4 years the equivalent of the entire French Navy. And I'll put a footnote to that to say that in September 2016, the French Navy was outstripped in the Mediterranean by the presence of the Chinese Navy. There were more Chinese naval vessels in the Mediterranean than there were French. And at present, the US administration is, of course, having a challenging time in working with its NATO allies, it's working with its Asian allies. There's a degree of unpredictability in the geopolitical environment. Europeans, for their part, are becoming a little bit more conscious that the world is a dangerous place, but their capabilities have been hollowed out since the end of the Cold War, and perhaps even more hollowed out in the wake of the austerity that they've had to conduct after 2008. Now, great power conflict isn't inevitable, but we are at an inflection point, and I think that some of the initiative is moving towards the challengers to the status quo rather than those who wish to protect the status quo. But defense spending is still an interesting indicator of the distribution of effort, and you can see from that slide that still today, the United States remains by far the largest defense spender in the world, at more than US $600 billion in the last year, 38% of the total. But Russia and China are spending quite well themselves. The difficulty is that Russian and Chinese defense spending is not very transparent. For instance, China, that is indubitably the second biggest defense spender in the world, we estimate their defense expenditure at $195 billion. The official budget in China is $150 billion. And the difference resides in the fact they don't put a lot of things in their defense budget. The State Council, for example, of China is in charge of arms purchases, and that's not part of their defense budget. The other interesting thing that has happened in recent years is the way in which defense spending has changed region by region. Since 2011, defense spending in Asia has surpassed total spending in Europe. And during the Cold War, while NATO states dedicated a high degree of their national wealth to military expenditure, with defense expenditure sometimes being as high as 6% of GDP, almost all key NATO states spending way above the current declared minimum of 2%, now only 5 do. And this slide shows a little bit those trends. Look at those numbers in 1980. France spending 3%, Germany 2.7%, Turkey 5%, the UK 6%, The United States, 6%. And then you come down all the way down to 2017, and you see those numbers rather dramatically reduced. 1.9% for France, 1.1% for Germany, United Kingdom just about holding it 2%, and the United States, even with this great talk about making America great again and spending a lot of money to ensure the United States stays ahead of their peer competitors. At 3.1%, it still is a proportion of GDP, a lot less than what United States was spending at the height of the Cold War. China is the country that is moving most rapidly to become a peer competitor of the United States. They have made rapid strides in the field of air-to-air missiles, putting high-value platforms of the United States that used to be able to loiter safely outside of engagement zones in the Taiwan Straits, for example, under great risk. Within the next 2 years, the United States will lose its monopoly on operational stealth combat aircraft, with the Chinese J-20 entering service, that J-20 having stealth technology that the Chinese state stole from Western industry through their intellectual property theft operations. China continues to pursue advanced technologies, extremely high-performance computing, quantum communications, AI, and what this slide is demonstrating is that they're making a lot of their advanced weapons available for export. Where the United States is unwilling to sell, the Chinese will often enter that vacuum, and the result is that there are more lethal weapons in more hands in more places, and the West will have to deal with an environment in which all military domains are more contested. Now, it's important also to underline that technology in itself is not the only factor that matters. The enemy gets a vote too, as military commanders like to say. The current US National Security Advisor, General McMaster, has a nice phrase. He says there are two ways to fight the United States military: asymmetrically and stupid. And of course, countries that have less technological capacity vote for fighting the United States asymmetrically. And it's also true that technology is difficult to adopt within armed forces. Chinese military lacks combat experience. They're in the process still of developing joint doctrine and training. But the point here is that China is catching up fast. And Chinese defense spending and military capabilities are not limited by mainland China's geographic borders. China is, of course, hugely concerned about maintaining its sovereignty over the South China Sea. And since 2013, China has reclaimed land at outposts in the South China Sea. And by 2015, it had reclaimed 2,900 acres of land, or 17 times more than all the other claimants to that territory combined. While President Xi Jinping pledged in 2015 not to militarize China's islands in the South China Sea, Chinese-occupied islands in the Spratlys now host munitions depots, sensor arrays, radar systems, missile shelters, as well as three 3,000-meter runways on the big three islands. And together, China's presence in the Paracels and the Spratlys provides the PLA pretty comprehensive military coverage of the entire South China Sea. And those of us gathered here in Davos have been extremely seized by that great Chinese geoeconomic experiment, the Belt and Road Initiative. And while it is primarily an economic project, the Belt and Road Initiative will be giving China tremendous infrastructure on which it could choose to build military installations, developing a wider international footprint. They already have a base in Djibouti, and they are exercising, as I said earlier, in the Baltic and Mediterranean seas. So when you hear the People's Republic of China perhaps noting with concern the occasional appearance of American, French, or British naval vessels in the South China Sea, the Chinese have been as close to the Baltics and the Mediterranean themselves. Now, moving back to Europe, we are, I think, properly concerned about the resurgence of a potential threat from Russia. Russia is a country that understands the laws of asymmetry in conflict. They've been able to bring different levers of state power to orchestrate the effect in causing challenges in Western Europe. The conflicts in which they've engaged in Ukraine, in Syria, have served as test and evaluation laboratories for Russian technology, military doctrine, and military personnel. And Russia has demonstrated lots of anti-access, area denial, force projection capabilities that are creating more challenges for Europe. We have a map here of Kaliningrad, just to remind geographically that Kaliningrad is Russian territory. It's an enclave within Poland, and Russia has the option of potentially deploying intermediate range weapons in Kaliningrad, and without wishing to frighten too much, if you look at those ranges, you can see that Davos would be within the range of Russian missiles that might be deployed in Kaliningrad. But actually, I don't think, personally, as a strategist, that it's Russian military deployments that are the greatest threat now to European security, stability, and prosperity. It's much more the asymmetric tactics that Russia is able to employ, and is doing so without limitations from domestic or international law. Russian strategy is to, where possible, undermine our open societies from the inside. And there are at least 3 areas where people here gathered in Davos, interested in the Western liberal order, interested in business and prosperity, should be concerned about, and the way in which Russia now exercises its state power. The first is the way in which they are leveraging their financial power, including in the private sector, potentially to purchase controlling shares in infrastructure in Europe that they might later be able to manipulate. The second is the propaganda that they are targeting steadily and effectively at Russian-speaking minorities in the Baltic states, in the Balkans, and in animating pro-Russian political parties, both on the left and the right wings of various political spectrums. And the third is in their assertion of cyber power through interference in democratic processes. And this includes the dissemination of perhaps not fake news, but junk news, trolling, and we should not rule out more direct interference. And we have a slide here showing RT and Sputnik, and there should be no doubt that these are instruments of the Russian state in order to advance Russian thinking and to undermine support for the open, prosperous societies in the liberal West. The sad fact is that today's Russia does not seem to be overly invested in the current international order. And while we worry about the rules-based order being undermined from within our Western societies because of the leaders that we sometimes actually elect or risk electing, the challenge to the rules-based order also comes from the outside, and I think Russia is a principal challenger of that rules-based order. Coming back to the debate on defense, though, again to see quite how big the gap has grown since the height of the Cold War. Look at the numbers there in 1990, the kinds of forces that West Germany alone had deployed or at its disposal, and you add those with Italy, France, United Kingdom, and the European Command of the United States. And then you look at the figures in 2015, all the way across this bottom screen. If you added up all of these charts in the bottom screen, Germany, Italy, France, UK, United States, European Command, they just about equal what West Germany alone had in 1990. So when people talk about the hollowing out of our military resources on the European continent, this is the gap they're talking about. There's no argument necessarily for going back all the way to those numbers, but this gap is quite an extraordinary one, especially at a time when Russia is determined to potentially use military force more on the European continent, as they have in Georgia and in Ukraine. And just looking at the personnel deployed numbers, look at those numbers from 1995, nearly 4 million, coming down over the years to just under 2 million. So when people are calling for an increase in defense budgets, an increase in equipment, an increase in personnel, this isn't an attempt to go back to the numbers of the Cold War, but just to begin to rebuild from the huge cuts that were optimistically taken when the Cold War ended and people thought there would be a peace dividend, and then the cuts that were additionally imposed after 2008 when the economics of austerity took hold. So in conclusion, the United States and Europe are now going through a bout of what I style strategic arthritis. There is so much effort in strengthening our domestic economies, on reconnecting with our people, on ensuring social inclusion and the like, understanding our electoral processes in the modern and digital age, and we have let the first mover advantage slip from us to these other anti-status quo powers, principally China and Russia. And if I were to leave you with one message, is that in geopolitics, just as in business, there is a first mover advantage. And in the last few years, Russia and China have been creating facts on the ground that complicate the maintenance of that liberal democratic order that we all champion. And if we are to sustain it, we need to gain the initiative politically and to a degree, again, even militarily. Thank you very much.
John, that was absolutely brilliant. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. So let me have you be thinking about your questions in the audience and online. Online, you can send in your questions at wwf.ch/betazone. And I'll also turn to what I get in from online as well. Let me start with one question, and I want to go back to Mattis's 2018 National Defense Review, which came out last week. There seems to be a shift in what he's doing. I'd like to hear from you how dramatic that is, considering everything that you've shown us here. And that is, he's saying terrorism is still important, but we're in great power competition again, and that's exactly what you've been talking about. He says that's where we have to focus our attention. And China and Russia, but they're quite different challenges. And so maybe you can drill down a little bit on how you think the U.S. is seeing these challenges differently and how they're going to equip themselves for it. He did still talk about North Korea and Iran and rogue situations, but not as the competition priority. And then in talking about the Middle East, it sounded as though the U.S. was going more in a direction of equipping its allies, and that it wasn't going to do as much on its own with its own military, but it was looking more at the great power. Does that sound about right, and how does this fit into to what you're seeing here?
Well, Jim Mattis, the current U.S. Secretary of Defense, is a great strategist with enormous experience of all three of those key domains, Europe, the Middle East, where he was CENTCOM commander, and the Asia-Pacific, or as some people like to style it, the Indo-Pacific. I would respond to your points in these ways. I think there is real concern in the United States that China will be, sooner than they had thought, a genuine peer competitor, and that the great scientific genius of China is being deployed also in order to leap into new domains. And so I think this national security strategy is an alert to the United States to make certain that the United States continues to stay a little bit ahead of China and maintains the capability to do what it wants to do, which is maintain the status quo. And if China ever got to the point where it felt it could change the status quo, including across the Taiwan Straits, by forcibly unifying Taiwan without any fear the United States could militarily prevent that, that would be destabilizing. So I think that's the way the United States is principally looking at China. It is China's military development amongst other powers that is the most challenging. In Russia, I think the United States establishment does see this broader array of threats coming from Russia and the need to have a genuinely comprehensive strategy. And of particular importance with Russia will be getting on the front foot in countering the kinds of narratives that Russia insidiously seeks to inject in the region. As for the Middle East, what is evident is that a number of Middle East powers are wanting to have the capability to take things in their own hands. And I think the most important thing for the United States to be doing in this period is be working closely with its partners still to ensure that there is a joint strategy for dealing with the common threats perceived in the Middle East. And here again in the Middle East, while there are some classic military threats, like, for example, the potential Iranian ballistic missile threats to the members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which could probably be met by coordinated GCC missile defense with the United States. There are other threats, like Iran's activity in the region, using proxies, using agents, using all sorts of other non-traditional actors, for which a proper diplomatic military strategy has not yet been arrived at, and I think that will be, in 2018, a very big priority of the US administration, working with its European allies and its key Middle Eastern allies, to understand how to contain Iran's continued effort to export its revolution.
Excellent, thanks, John. And we've got 7-8 minutes left. Let me ask one more question, and then I'll go to you and I'll go online. And I know this one you could answer in 2 hours, but the one thing that Mattis also said, which pertains to this, is part of it is interesting is what's happening with the numbers, what's happening with the percentages. Part of it is how much of it is useful and how much of it is useless. And he's essentially saying we're investing in a lot of legacy systems that may not even be useful in future scenarios. As you look at the military balance from that standpoint, is the U.S. as robust as we think it is?
I think Jim Mattis makes a very good point, especially in the European theater. Too much effort in the debate in NATO and in Europe has been on inputs, like getting 2% to defense expenditure. But that's an input measure, it's not an output measure. Another measure is spending 20% of your defense budget on equipment. Well, that's fine, but what are you actually buying with it? And are you buying the relevant things? Are you able to operate with allies? And I think another priority for the United States and its European allies in 2018 will be again rehearsing collaborative military activity. NATO hasn't done in the last 10 or 15 years the kinds of exercises that it was during the Cold War. And I think one of the things that the US and its European allies will need to be doing is to reinvent the kinds of exercises that will be relevant to meet the potential challenges from Russia in the next few years.
Thank you very much. So one question from online, it could also be from one of you here, and this is from Mr. or Ms. Anonymous. The question is, what's the biggest concern the U.S. has on China's military development? So to drill down and get a little bit more specific, let me add my own to that, which is I've heard from the Pentagon growing concern about the space domain, which has a lot to do with the Internet of Things, has a lot to do with GPS and autonomous vehicles and almost everything else now.
So the two things the United States are concerned about, and I'll treat the second first, is indeed space. China has put an enormous amount of effort into space technology, launching more satellites and being able to win the arms race in space. So that is a domain that's hugely interesting and worrying to the United States. I think the second is its access and area denial strategy, where US aircraft carriers and others become so vulnerable operating in the region that they lose their military effectiveness.
Questions, please. Identify yourself, and we know who you're asking the questions.
Hello, Mr. Chipman. Itamar Rabinovich from Israel. Given what you just said about the U.S. need to rethink strategy vis-a-vis Iran in 2018, what is your position on the JCPOA?
I have a very simple view on the Iran deal, which is that it is a technical agreement. It's an arms control agreement. Now, in the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had all sorts of arms control agreements. And those arms control agreements did not remotely imply that the United States and the Soviet Union had strategic agreement on anything else, nor did it prevent the United States and the Soviet Union from competing all around the world in order to win for their own side. So I would prefer people in the region to see the Iranian agreement for the narrow technical agreement that it is. It's a simple arms control agreement. Put that in a box. And the reason it's useful to put that in a box is that without that box, Iran would be a few months away from a nuclear weapon. Now it might be, if they adhere to the agreement and we adhere to the agreement, 10 years away from a weapon. Sometimes in diplomacy and strategy, kicking the can down the road is not a bad thing. During those 10 years, there's every reason for the United States, its partners and allies in the Middle East to continue to confront Iran in all the other geographies and in all the other domains in which Iran is acting as a malign actor. And the JCPOA does not prevent the United States, its Gulf allies, its European allies, its partner in Israel to confront Iran in these other domains on these other subjects.
Excellent answer. Majid Jafar. Oh, hold on. Let's wait for the microphone. And if you could identify yourself, even though
Majid Jafar, Crescent Petroleum. So in the UAE. First question, very basic and a clarification question, which was the number of troops you said at the disposal of West Germany. Presumably those were mostly U.S. and other, so not German troops. It's not a like for like. But then this is kind of an ignorant devil's advocate question. The presentation was very much about decline in troop levels and spending as well. Does that matter so much today? I mean, aren't we anyway, every industry represented here is seeing less labor intensity and more automation, including my own oil and gas. So isn't that just the way things are headed with defense as well? Does it matter not having as many troops? Is it about defensive capability against a particular threat, or is it about the ability to operate in multiple theaters at one time?
There's no question that quality is usually much better than quantity in the current strategic era where technology is so very important. The difficulty is that there hasn't been as much investment in that technology, and there remain strategic moments when there is a need to be able rapidly to deploy to a theater, to have troops on the ground to be able to hold and maintain territory. And there has been a technological conceit in the past where technology could do everything for you and the human dimension was less important. Remember during the second Iraq War, when the then US Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, was arguing with his commanders all the time, can't we do this with fewer and fewer troops? And ultimately they were trying to do it with as few as 75,000, when actually part of the challenge, once the conflict was won with Iraq, was holding territory, making certain that there wouldn't be looting, making certain there was basic stability, while one permitted some form of Iraqi state to reconstruct itself. So in great power conflict, which unfortunately is a risk I've identified, people do matter, and ability to rapidly deploy matter, and even the United Kingdom and France, the two European powers that have traditionally had a capacity rapidly to deploy, are hollowing that capacity out, and it makes it very difficult for them to be proper partners to the United States in maintaining order.
So as they say in the TV business, we're going to leave it at that. As I've said many times here, that what I love about the World Economic Forum is hearing the greatest experts in the world in their fields speak to you and share their insights into the global situation, and that's what we've had in John Chipman of IISS. So thank you very much, John.
Fred, thank you.